All right.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Veterans Breakfast Club Happy Hour for February 26th. My name is Sean Hall. I'm the Director of Programming with the VBC. Our mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. I do see some returning names, some people we haven't seen in a while. Josh Cannon, good to see you. Been a while. Hope you're well. Henry Shepke, always great to see you, our youngest member. Henry, thanks for rejoining us. Yeah, it's looking like a good room tonight. With me as always, Todd DiPastino. Todd, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. It was a balmy, 65 degrees here in Pittsburgh in February. I saw somebody walking around with shorts and a tank top. I think that was pushing it, but it was a really, really nice day.
It felt nice. It was wonderful to have that little respite in the middle of February. You don't usually get those. Tonight we're going to be focusing on the author and veteran Ian Fritz. Ian, if you'd like to give it a little wave just so people can see where you're at on the screen. He wrote the book, What the Taliban Told Me. Looking forward to diving into your story. You're an airborne cryptologic linguist, a DIZO. So I'm sure we're having some maybe 9/11 vets, post 9/11 vets joining us tonight that'll be interested to hear your story. We want to quickly thank our sponsors. We'll dive into a bit more about their participation and details a little later in the program, but tobacco-free Adagio Health, who's been with us for quite some time. I'd like to thank them for sponsoring this program, as well as UPMC for Life. They are a new sponsor to the VBC. So thank you both for joining us or for supporting the VBC Happy Hour. I'd like to bring up a quick share of my screen because we do have a new Scuttlebutt. And for those of you who maybe follow the Scuttlebutt, you may remember Ian because he was a guest of mine last year at some point. Todd and I were just talking about another guest, and we said, did we ever have that person join us? And once you've done as many as we have, it's hard to remember. Heck, I can't remember what I had for breakfast, let alone what guests I've had on in the last couple of years. But as you can see on your screen, author and poet Victoria Kelly joined me recently to talk about her recent book, Homefront, which is a collection of stories. She was a Blue Star wife, married to an Air Force fighter pilot who went through several deployments. She was a writer, got into poetry, wrote a poetry, like a poetry collection of like military wife stories. So we talk a bit about that first book that she wrote, When Men Go Off to War. This is her third book. Her second book was a fiction book called Mrs. Houdini. But Homefront was recently released. Check it out on Amazon. I had a great conversation with her. She was very interesting. It was a lot of fun. And I just encourage you to check it out on our website. It's www.veteransbreakfastclub.org, especially for those of you who may be joining us for the very first time and are just finding out about the VBC. That's where you find out everything about us on our website. You can not only donate to our mission, but you can become a member. You can sign up for our e-blast. You can send us your address, and we can send you a quarterly free magazine, which we'll talk about later. Whole bunch of great stuff. I say that's all the announcements I have for right now. Todd, do you have anything before we kick things off?
No, let's kick things off. I do want to say just hello to everybody. I see our oldest member. You mentioned Henry Shepke is our youngest member. I see our oldest member right tonight on so far is Ed Cottrell, 102 years old, P-47 pilot. Good to see you, Ed. Thank you for joining us from North Carolina. I appreciate it very much.
Ed, it's great to see you. So yeah, let's dive in, Ian. Ian, thank you again for joining me. I had such a great conversation with you the first time. It's nice to have you back. Come on for the live show. I thought we would start things back a bit because we know we're going to get into Air Force. You were 08 to 2013. You listened in on the Taliban in Afghanistan. But let's dive back a bit. We just mentioned in the green room that you're from Lake City, Florida, and I remember talking with you that you did not come from a military family. Is that right?
No, My father was apparently in the army, but I never knew anything about that, and I didn't know him long enough to ever hear anything about it. And he allegedly was very quickly discharged for punching somebody out. So he wasn't in the army for very long.
Sure, that was a story. But yeah, you were working actually as a waiter, and then you were. How did you find out about the military? What kind of drew you that route?
Hmm. So yeah, I grew up in a small town in North Florida, Lake City. It's like 10,000 people or so. And in high school, I was a waiter in a Chinese restaurant. Um, in 10th grade, a very charming and very gregarious recruiter came to my high school and talked to a class that I was in. And he was just giving a generic spiel, I think, but he had talked about his job of an airborne cryptologic linguist. And so that was the 10th grade. Obviously, I was like 16. I couldn't join the military if I wanted to. Um, Go forward a couple of years, I didn't get into college. I graduated high school, and I didn't really know what I was going to do with my life. And I remembered with this job that this recruiter had talked about. If you say it real quickly and put it out there real nice, like it's like, hey, we'll pay you to go learn a language in California and then fly around in a giant spy plane and travel the world. And that was basically the pitch. And it's a real good pitch. It's still a real good pitch. So I remembered that, and I went and found a recruiter. It wasn't the same guy. It was someone else had rotated in by that point. But I found him and asked to go through all the testing and whatnot that you have to go through to do that. And I did. And I joined a little bit less than a year after I graduated high school.
So when you first heard that first pitch, what year was that? How old were you? Were 16. What year was that?
16, so 2005 probably.
Okay, so 9/11 had already happened.
Yeah. I was in seventh grade when now it happened.
Can you talk to me a bit about I personally, I think I was in my senior year. It kind of hit. No, I'm sorry. I misspoke. I was in my sophomore year of college. Can you speak a bit about how young you were? What 9/11, what you perceived as that? Like, it's such a big day. We all remember where we were, but I haven't talked to somebody who was maybe that young at that point.
It like honestly didn't mean a whole lot to me. I can definitely remember I was in Mr. Bell's technology class in seventh grade at Lake City Middle School, and like I remember watching the TV and all of that. I couldn't tell you anything about the next day or the next week other than I don't know, it's like all everyone was talking about. It wasn't like I didn't have enough, political awareness, and my family wasn't political in any meaningful way. That it like really affected me. And I mean, Lake City, Florida, we're very far from anything that like, was a target or ever could be a target. Um, and yeah, I didn't have there weren't like adults in my life who talked about it very much, I think. So it honestly didn't mean a whole lot to me until like significantly later in my life.
So it's very interesting because, Afghanistan kicks off immediately. Iraq happens, 2003. Um, these are all still happening by the time you enlist. Were you any bit aware of how those wars were developing when you decided to enlist?
No, not at all. Like, yeah, absolutely not.
So really it was just about getting out of where you were living to kind of be a part of this kind of cool world that you heard about.
Yeah, I mean, the recruiter, had told me I could choose the language I wanted to learn. So I said I wanted to learn Russian because I don't know, I was pretentious. And so it's like, what am I gonna? I'm not gonna have anything to do with Iraq or Afghanistan, and then even if I did, I was supposed to, fly. Most linguists fly on these giant jumbo jets of airplanes, and they deploy, but they don't go to Iraq or they don't go to Afghanistan. They go to Qatar and they, hang out on a giant airbase and then fly these missions at 30,000 feet, 500 miles an hour. And it's like, it's not, uh, I have friends who did that job and they would be the first to say that like, oh, they didn't like fight the war in Afghanistan, right? But even I didn't have that, nuance available to me. I was like, I'm going to learn Russian. I'm going to be in the military, whatever that means. And then like, okay, we'll find out what the rest is.
Had you learned any previous languages prior to joining the military?
No, no. I mean, I like took French in high school because you had to, but I don't know any French at all.
Did you have to shift sort of your mindset, the way that you approach studying, having to learn? You learned both Dari and Pashto in a span of about 3 years, right?
Yeah, so I mean, Dari, I went to through the traditional Dari course at the Defense Language Institute, which is a year long, and then the normal Pashto course is a year and a half, but I did it in 6 months because I went through an accelerated course, in large part because I already knew Dari and the languages are, they have a lot of shared vocabulary. They don't share any grammar or anything like that, but they have a lot of shared vocabulary, and knowing one can help you learn another. So my best friend and I were put through an accelerated course. To answer your question of like changing studying, that would imply that I had any habits of studying, which is not the case. I was a very ambivalent student most of my life. Um, I was very fortunate that I had very good classmates, a number of whom were older than me and like could help teach me discipline. And I had a very good team of teachers when I went to the language school for the first time to learn Dari, who more or less made it impossible to slack off. Specifically, our like sort of teaching team leader was a young, hard driving kind of guy, and he really made us work hard and encouraged us to work hard. And he wasn't like a drill instructor or anything. They're all civilians, but he facilitated studying in a way that didn't feel quite so like, oh, I'm sitting down and doing homework all the time. And I just really liked it. I am and was and always will be a giant nerd at heart, and learning a new language is like one of the most fun things you can do in life.
See, that's interesting because you hadn't really had a passion for it prior to the military, but it became something more of a passion the more you did it.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up hearing other languages. So my mother was raised in North Africa and grew up speaking Bambara and French before she spoke English, before she learned English. So I had heard these languages. As I said, I mean, I don't know, I barely know any French. I definitely know zero Bambara. But I think I'd been exposed to them. But I have always been a pretty big reader. And so I think just like words and language in general heavily appeal to me. I'm abysmally bad at math. Can't do it to save my life. But words I've always liked, and I think have had some facility with.
That's where we're completely different. I love numbers and I'm abysmally bad at words. So it's a, I don't know, left brain, right brain thing. When you go in for this specific would you call it an MOS in Air Force?
It's an AFSC in the Air Force.
AFSC. When you go in that for, do you do basic prior to go into the linguist school?
Yeah. So you go to basic training, and then in my case, there's a course called Aircrew Fundamentals, which is like 3 weeks or something at Medina, which is an annex connected to Lackland Air Force Base. This was before, it's all now like one super base, I think. But back when Lackland was just Lackland, Medina was an annex. Go to Aircrew Fundamentals. There's this very long pipeline to become a linguist, and it was backed up. So I went from Aircrew Fundamentals to survival school for the first time, which is in Washington State, or SEER. Some people know that, SERE.
Yep.
I did that, and then I went to language school the first time, and then you have to go to cryptologic school, which is in Texas at Goodfellow Air Force Base in San Angelo. So I went there. I had to go back to survival school because you have to do another course if you are flying on special operations aircraft. Then you have to go to water survival school, and then I got to my base, and then I went back to language school, and I went back to my base, and I learned how to fly on the planes I flew on.
That, and how long was that path until you finally started to learn the planes you were flying
on? Just shy of 3 years.
Okay.
I think I had my first training mission in January of 2011, and I joined in February of 2008.
Was it what you expected? You kind of went in thinking like you had heard about it prior. You said it kind of sounded sexy. Was it what you expected?
No. So the majority of airborne linguists in the Air Force fly aboard the RC-135 Rivet Joint, which is stationed at Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska. The RC-135 is a multi-$100 million spy plane. I think it's a 747 base. Don't quote me on that. someone here probably knows more than me, but very large plane, multiple linguists on board it. Again, it flies at 30,000 feet, 500 miles an hour in these 200-mile loops, right? That is like true spy craft, and they fly like 12, 16, 20-hour missions, and it's very like strategic and, um, listen to all kinds of like state secrets and that sort of thing. That's what I thought I was going to do because that's what like basically every linguist before me had ever done. Every new linguist, older, more established linguists traditionally became what were called DISOs, which is what I wound up doing, a direct support operator on board Air Force Special Operations aircraft. But like the idea that I would ever fly on a gunship was ridiculous when I joined, and even like when I got to my duty station, when I got to AFSOC, it was sort of there were lots and lots of people who were like, "What are you doing here?" Because they didn't ask for me or my best friend. It was just like big Air Force gave us orders, and that's where we went.
Mhm.
That coupled with I didn't have, as I said, I didn't really have good expectations, like or realistic expectations whatsoever. It's hard to because so much of the work is classified in the first place, and like not that many people do it. So this recruiter, could describe this job in theory, but he has no idea what he's talking about. Just because, like, why would he? He's not a linguist. But then that coupled with being having gotten stationed at AFSOC, I had no idea what I'd signed up for, basically.
Um, where did you land out in Afghanistan when you were deployed?
Kandahar.
And what was it like when you first got there?
So it was March of 2011, my first deployment. It was wet. Everyone, a lot of people, think Afghanistan's desert. It has a rainy season, a very, very rainy season. Kandahar is very strange. It's very built up, right? It's joint. There's, Canadians and Dutch and Germans and Belgians and French, and there's this thing, the boardwalk, where there's literally a TGI Fridays and like a French bakery, and
Were all those things added? I mean, by the time you got there, that we'd been there for quite some time. Were all those
yeah,
added?
that was all there. That was all there when I got there, right? So I like ate, fried chicken at TGI Fridays or something, and had a $5 Coke. Like got a smoothie at a French bakery or whatever, and there was a discotheque. I think it was the Belgians that built it like literally a dance hall. It's very it's I couldn't have called it surreal then, like I didn't have that vocabulary, but I can absolutely call it surreal now. Insofar as like, yes, I'm technically deployed, and like technically I'm deployed to an active war or whatever, but it was you got mortared, like there were mortars, but they never really hit anybody, or very, very, very rarely hit anybody.
Hmm.
And then there's like all this, normal American stuff everywhere.
It probably felt very much like Wonderland, almost, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, my camp was, on the opposite side of the base from all that stuff. So like I didn't spend a ton of time on the boardwalk. I had friends who their tents were like here's the boardwalk and their tent is just over here. I had to drive 25 minutes or whatever and flew a lot. And so like didn't necessarily have access to that. My side of my camp was more like, okay, yes, we walked safely to, a dining facility or whatever, but otherwise it was like we were kind of just amongst ourselves, flying and then sleeping and then flying and then sleeping.
So before we get to sort of like the missions that you were on, the things that you were listening to, can you tell me a bit about Dari and Pashto? Like the language, like I don't know if you want to use an example or if like, I'm trying to figure out like how different of a language is it from what we hear? And obviously you were fluent in it by the time you reached Afghanistan.
Mm. So Dari is people generally speaking know the term Farsi, or Persian, which is so Persian writ large is sort of what people in Iran and like northern Afghanistan speak. And Farsi and Dari are just sort of Western names for that, right? So if you've ever heard of Farsi, it's Dari is the same thing. They're written with the Arabic alphabet plus a few extra letters, right? So all those sort of squiggles and dots, like if you spaghetti at a wall. Pashto is based on the same alphabet. It's just a sort of more complicated language. Persian itself is, as far as languages go, relatively simple. There's no gender. The grammar is quite rational. It's pretty straightforward. Pashto is very complicated, is historically predominantly an oral language, which is to say it wasn't really written down until relatively recently in history. And so people only learn it from speaking, right? It's like I probably went to the greatest language school for Pashto in the world at the time anyway, and probably still actually, because it wasn't taught well in Afghanistan because Afghanistan is, well, Afghanistan. Um, as for, I mean, I don't know, the grammatical intricacies, right? Like, it's backwards from English, right? In Dari, you
Okay.
would say, to the store I went, the verb always comes at the end. Pashto is the same way. The verb always comes at the end of the sentence. Um, Pashto has gender, which is very strange. It has these things called declensions, which if anyone speaks Russian, Russian has declensions. If you ever had to learn Latin in school, you know the terror of declensions. But functionally, that just means that words change in a really annoying way. So if you say like a house, the word for house, and if you say a blue house, the word for house changes. And if you say a big blue house, the word might change again. And there's a system, but English doesn't have this. Like English doesn't have anything approaching this. So it's very strange for English speakers who don't know any other languages to learn this sort of system. Um, we would English speakers tend to call the languages very guttural, right? There's a lot of like sounds and closed glottal sounds like Cockney in English, like my cocaine and that sort of thing. That can take some getting used to. And then the other thing is that like I'm listening to guys talk over like high-powered walkie-talkies, so there's a lot of static, there's a lot of noise, there's just a lot of gobbledygook in the way.
And how quickly would they be speaking it? Like, obviously, they're, it's their native language, and you're dealing with different accents, I'm sure, in different parts of Afghanistan. Like we have Pittsburghese and, Bronx and Brooklyn and Mountaineer, in the span
Yeah.
of, the same region as Afghanistan, really.
Yeah, so Dari is like relatively straightforward pretty much everywhere, but Pashto at a baseline has two dialects, Eastern and Western. So the alphabet has 44 letters and a few of the letters change. So on one side of the country, one of the letters is pronounced J, and on the other side of the country, it's pronounced gay. And so you could literally hear the same word depending on where you are. And in the middle of that word, you can hear a zh sound or a g sound. There's another letter that on one side of the country, it's a sh sound, and on the other side, it's a х sound. And so, like, words can change pretty dramatically, even though it's technically the exact same word. And if you read it, it's written the exact same way, but it is pronounced differently. That's like the formal dialect system. You can 100% like be in Valley A and go over a mountain into Valley B, and like these two groups of people would have a hard time talking to each other because the dialects can be pretty wildly different because Afghanistan's so mountainous and so rural. You get these not like, uncontacted tribes or whatever. Like these people have phones, right? They know what the internet is. Um, but they're pretty well segregated. And so it's like, yeah, like Pittsburghese, like Yinzers, right? Yinzers talk like Yinzers. And like back in the day, guys from deep Brooklyn talk like guys from deep Brooklyn, and guys from Philly talk like guys from Philly, and never the twain shall meet. And so it becomes, um, these own like codified dialects or whatever. So I mean, they talk normal speak, normal speak. They talk like anybody talks. If they're mad or in a fight, they talk faster because they're yelling. But there were plenty of places where like the dialect is so thick that I just couldn't understand anything.
Oh, interesting. Ben Wright wrote in, do you use linguistics today in life or employment?
Not in any formal capacity. I read quite a lot. That's a very small number of the books I have, and I'm very fascinated by language, and I've been recently reading a lot of um, ordinary language philosophy, Wittgenstein and Stanley Cavell, and people who think about how language affects the mind. So not necessarily like other languages, but how language works and how language forms how we see the world. I'm very interested in and think about quite a lot. As in my work, no, I primarily, outside of writing, I primarily consult in biotechnology. And so that is far from proper language as you can get because it's all making PowerPoints.
I almost want to get philosophical with you right now because you brought up the question of the idea of like, what do you think of that? Those two questions that you're sort of mulling over right now, and what brings you to those?
Like how language affects the world.
Yeah, and your
I
mind.
can't you right without being like an annoying narcissistic solipsist, right? And if we assume that everything actually exists outside of us, like I assume that you are real and not a figment of my imagination, right? Which is unprovable, but let's accept that it's reality. Um, how do I talk about you? If how right this ends and my partner gets home in an hour and a half or whatever, and I go to talk to her about tonight, and if I have the language to describe you as a human, as this kind, soft-spoken, inquisitive, right, like sharp dude, cool. That paints a picture for her and lets her experience what I experienced. If I don't have that language or for some reason I decided none of those things about you were true, right? I decided I don't like you or whatever. And like all of that, now like she has this worldview of what happened to me that is inherently dictated and therefore limited by my language, right? And so like Wittgenstein, right, tried to define the limits of what we can know. And by doing so, he would say, okay, this is all the stuff we can't talk about because we can't possibly know about it. And then he talked about it anyway, because like that's the human condition, right? We can't know about God, we can't know about spirits, blah, blah, blah. But we're gonna talk about them because we want to talk about them. But the idea of that, of like language necessarily limits what it is that you can and cannot talk about, is wildly important, I think. And like maybe not actually in day-to-day living, but if you're trying to figure out or think about like what it means to be among other people, I think it's a very important concept.
I love that. I'm going to try to stay on your good side because I want to have a good report. um, as you learn somebody else's language and culture, does an answer like that speak to their sort of belief in language as well, like the way that they speak? And I know we're sort of diving down a rabbit hole here and maybe dipping a bit away from sort of the military idea of what your job was and different stuff. But this is also in the same realm, I believe, of what your job was, what your passion was, that you go in there and you're listening to a whole different culture, a whole different group of people, trying to understand them at a different level than most people like would be sitting on a forward operating base and defending a position, or out beyond the wire, or maybe more so the people that were working with terps in on the front line trying to work with within each tribe. There's a bit more of the language barrier there and trying to work with them. I'm very intrigued by this, and sort of like as you began to learn more about the Afghan culture and their language, how that language came about. It's so ancient.
So I mean, the culture thing is this sort of gets lost. So at the Defense Language Institute, the language school that I went to that is run by the Department of Defense, you don't just learn a language. You really have to, every single language that gets taught there, you have to learn the culture along with it, because very rarely you're pointing out here, right? You cannot Yinzers. If you don't know what yins means and you go to Pittsburgh, like you're not going to understand when somebody uses a possessive plural pronoun. You're not going to know what they're saying. I went to medical school in Pittsburgh, and there was a physician there who talked about how when he first moved there, people would say to him, "Oh, whatever yins say." And he thought that like yins was a person, like another doctor. Like he had no idea what was happening, right? And so at language school, you have to learn all this culture. We had to learn proverbs, and we had to learn, like there's a Pashto version of an Aesop fable that legitimately involves a monkey hammering a nail through his penis to teach a moral story, right? That is like different than how Aesop decided to teach us moral stories, right? And different from like the Grimm fairy tales. And then within that, right, but then there are universals. Like as far as I know, every single language has dick jokes. Like it's just a thing. Everybody can make a dick joke in every single language on earth. It's great.
It's
So
especially if you're in the
cool.
military, because that's kind of
Especially in the military, right? So there's these universals, but then like thinking about listening to the Taliban and thinking about going back to, right, not to, I've been reading a lot of Wittgenstein, so I'm sorry, but this idea of like the world being limited by language, right? There's probably everyone here has heard the term jihad, right, or jihad, right? And we think of terrorists performing jihad against America and all this stuff. And the word jihad in Arabic does mean, right, like holy war. It can mean that. It also just means struggle. I can have a jihad against like my desire to eat cake every night of my life. Probably like I shouldn't, I'm not going to use that word in that context very often because it's a little bit not like less blasphemous, but like yeah, it's a little weighty for that particular struggle in life. But very much I could have, jihad against my struggle to be like a good parent or something like that. But we and the many members of the Taliban only know the word jihad as far as like fighting a holy war, right? That's like all they can think about. And because they don't have the education of what is actual, they don't know Arabic. They memorize the Quran, which is written in Arabic. None of them know Arabic because like where would they learn Arabic? And so they're the way that they're talking about fighting, right? It's a very like when I'm listening to stuff, like it's cool that I learned a language in a short period of time. Neat, super great. A lot of people help me. Maybe there's some innate ability. The language I listen to on a daily basis for my job, not that complicated, right? Like the doing of it was hard because I'm in a noisy plane and like there's a lot going on, sure. But the language itself was incredibly simple because the language of fighting is pretty straightforward. Like anybody here has listened to a radio of like Americans talking about it. It's simple, direct language. No one's talking about Wittgenstein over a radio, right? And so the Taliban, it's like they obviously, and I heard them talking about their day-to-day life and all these sorts of things, but even then, it's like they're not. Afghanistan is not a well-educated country. There isn't a ton of like debate over these greater nuances of life because their life has been like whittled down to this very, narrow focus.
All right, so we'll take a pause on the diving down the rabbit hole, but I love this. Let's get to your first mission out and what that was like for you getting up into the plane, and you had all this training behind you, but applying it, how difficult was that?
My first mission was all but impossible because my first mission was a very, very large battle. Um, it's detailed pretty thoroughly in my book, and you can go watch videos of it because there was a reporter embedded that particular day. But it was the numbers were like 300 Taliban got killed, 6 Americans died. I don't know how many more got wounded, like a bunch. There were 5 or 6 Casavacs, like fighters dropping bombs. It was like wild. So that was all going on, and it was in a particular part of the country where the dialect was really, really hard for me to listen to. I was with my first mission. I was with another linguist because it was sort of the last like training wheels mission, because it was my first one in Afghanistan, and both of us were just like, this is insane. Like we can't. There's so much going on. It's incredibly difficult to understand anything. There's so many people talking, and we don't really understand the dialect. So that notwithstanding, mission where I actually understood everything. It's honestly again because it's like pretty straightforward language. As long as I could hear, as long as there wasn't a ton of noise, and as long as it wasn't like a dialect where I can't understand anything, I knew the language. And so I could, I'm not gonna say I didn't get 100%. I probably never got to 100%. But you even when we hear other people, right? We all, talk over Zoom all the time now, and Zoom goes in and out, and you miss a word here and there, and your brain will just auto-populate. Like you'll just figure it out. You'll fill it in. Sometimes you'll fill it in wrong, and that's not so great. And there's times where you're like, I don't want to fill it in, and I really want to know exactly what was said. But a lot of the time you can figure it out because you just know how language works and how people tend to talk. So I mean, my training, the flight training I received, it's 9 flights to be qualified, and none of those involve using your language skills. Right, that's just 9 flights to learn how to exist on an AC-130, and there's no ability to train using the language for that. So my first flight in Afghanistan was my first time doing my job listening to the language.
And what was that like finally for the first time? I'm sure you had already been speaking it with other, just like, did you have any interpreters that you would sit down and talk with just to kind of like develop a rapport, like hear the language more so in the native tongue, as opposed to like, back in the States and talking with your classmates?
No, I mean when you learn it, like language school, it's all from native instructors. So that is like I sounded like I was from a very specific part of Afghanistan because I sounded like one of my teachers when I spoke. Like I developed his accent, right? Like if I learned English from a guy from deep Brooklyn or something, or the deep South. But the once I'm in Kandahar, no, I never talked to any Afghans because I talked to that's not true. I talked to two Afghans once in a market because there was a bazaar like every week. They would let locals onto the base, and I went and bought a knockoff of a Rolex. And I talked to them, and they were very confused about me talking to them, not in English. Um, but other than that, it's like I had spent at that point, I'd been, I'd spent a couple of years listening to Afghans talk. I had spent 8 months or so listening to Afghans speak Pashto, which was basically my job. Like I didn't listen that much Dari, I just pretty much listened Pashto. So hearing it was, I'd literally been training for that for months, every single day of my life for months. So doing it for the first time, it was sort of like, okay, this is now I just have to like incorporate these other skills of flying. But the hearing it was sort of rote by that point.
How difficult was it to learn the skills of flying on the C-130?
That shit's mad hard. That's really hard. You only get these like 9 flights or whatever of training, or like that's how many it's supposed to take. You do some ground training before that. We learn how to use equipment and whatnot. But speaking of language, if anybody here, right, flew in any sort of aircraft in any position, there's this specific language of people of how you talk on planes. It changes in different, like during takeoff and landing, it's like you don't talk at all, actually, right? It's like a sterile cockpit. You have to be, because those are the most dangerous times of flying. That's when people die. But when you want to talk to somebody, you have to say their position and then your position to identify who's talking to whom. And then you say certain things in orders and there are checklists, and there's this whole other way of talking. And then you have to be able to talk to multiple people and listen to multiple people at once. That was the hardest part of the job that I did, was that I had to be able to listen to the Taliban and listen to my plane and potentially listen to people on the ground and potentially listen to other people in other planes all at once, because that's just like what it required. So developing that situational awareness, I don't really know that I could do it today. Like I feel that we all have really bad attention spans now because of phones and technology and all those stuff. I do think being young helped. I had friends who were older and learned to do my job, and they found it much harder. I do think that the young brain is more plastic and able to do things like this a little bit more easily. But that is a wildly difficult skill set, and like getting good at it is a matter of like years, I think.
I unmuted Dave Seaver. He's a recent retiree nurse of Air Force. Dave, is that your experience flying in C-130s?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold, so I don't have a great voice. But yeah, and Ben can probably back you up. The Air Force is willing to pay for certain things and not for others, and insulation is not one of them. So any Air Force aircraft is going to be uber noisy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I watch movies where people are, the war movies, and they're in the back of the C-130 and they're conversing like we are here, and I just laugh. You have to just about scream to be heard in the back of a 130 or a KC-135 or a C-17, you name it. They are just loud. I
Yeah.
have tinnitus from all that.
Yeah, everyone has tinnitus, and they vibrate, which also hurt your ears. But
Oh yeah.
you get a headset and it has a boom mic, right? The first thing anyone tells you is you put that boom mic in your lips. Like it can't be out here because no one will be able to hear you. You put it against your mouth. Like an actual microphone, there's so much noise, you have to literally put it against yourself to be heard through a closed loop system. It's just goofy loud.
Yeah, vibration and noise are two of the stressors of flight.
Yeah.
Which I could give you a whole discourse on, but I won't, because that's not where we're at tonight. But yeah.
Ian, Todd put in the chat here, how long were your missions? We started to alluded on that a bit prior to that. How long were your missions? And it sounded exhausting concentrating for that long.
Most of them were that. The C-130s can't fly for that long without having to refuel. They can refuel in flight with KC-135s, right? Pretty cool technology. I think the average was 5 hours, but also it's like that's 5 hours and it might be an hour of transit each way. So then I'm sort of only on station for like 3 hours. I think my longest flight was almost 10, like 9 something.
No break, 10 hours of listening.
No. Well, that one probably like 8,
Mhm.
uh, maybe 8.5, because it was so long because uh, everything went bad. Like it just went sideways, I think. And so that was probably close to 8, and that's like you get back and you just like eat food and pass out. It's not uh it's not all that exhausting in the moment because there's adrenaline, right? It's kind of hard to
Mhm.
be that tired. Like maybe there's fatigue, but even that is like sort of overridden. Afterwards, though, it's very, but it sort of doesn't matter because you have to fly the next day. So like I would say it's more of a cumulative thing that like when you get home from a deployment, it's like, okay, I'm gonna sleep 12 hours a day for 2 weeks.
Right.
And that's the sort of way that that works.
And as you started to listen in, Brad put in the chat here, what surprised you the most about listening in to the Taliban?
Um, it's a very long answer to that, which is in the book, but the short answer is their humanity. So there's this idea of the Taliban as this like monolithic evil entity, which do not get me wrong, Taliban as a political organization is awful and should be eliminated from the earth in some form, in some method. But individual guys running around on the ground often were just like dudes who were poor and needed a job and or wanted to protect their family or wanted to feed their family. They were funny, like a lot of the time, right? As I mentioned, dick jokes galore.
Mhm.
Um, they were scared. They were not voracious killing machines, and like probably to most people here who appear to be adults of reasonable age and intelligence, that's not like that novel of a thought. But to 22-year-old me, that was a very novel thought. 22-year-old me who grew up in the conservative rural South where like everyone who's an enemy of America is 100% an enemy of America and not anything else. The idea that they were just like people was very surprising.
So it shifted your worldview a lot.
Mm. Yeah, quite a lot. Um, I mean, it fundamentally changed like how I view not violence, but war for sure. I think like the vast majority of war is centered around this idea that other people are inherently different from us and like necessarily inherently worse than us. And that's just probably not true in 99% of cases.
Mhm. Whenever you were flying, was there more than one linguist on board from Brad in the chat, or did you have multiple?
Nope, just me. Um, this is like a wild thing now to think about, but so RC-135 is, like I said, a lot of they have a lot of linguists on board, and they have the ability to talk to other planes and talk to the ground and like consult other people. DISOs, direct support operators, you fly on board AFSOC aircraft, it's just you. There's no one you can talk to. No one on the plane, no one else on the plane understands the language. You can't like call back to base to get a second opinion. You can't call to other planes to get a second opinion. It is truly just you making decisions about what you heard.
And what type of decisions did you have to make?
And yeah, that's a baity thing to say, I guess. Here and there, kill people, don't kill people. Here and there, these guys are gonna ambush you. They're not gonna ambush you. They got a machine gun. They don't got a machine gun. Um, they're getting reinforcements. They're not getting reinforcements. The biggest the less like baity answers. The decision is about like how to relay what you heard to other people, right? Because providing direct translation is not all that useful, right? If I hear a dude say, "We're moving east," cool. I could tell somebody that, but it's like, okay, where are they moving east from? Is maybe pretty important. And like, how many of them are moving east? And like, maybe why are they moving east? And these sorts of things. So it's like that's the other difficult part of the job is the hearing it, understanding what was said. Okay, let's say you got that down, then figuring out like, okay, how do I tell somebody else what I heard in a way that's relatively brief pretty understandable and also useful, uh, could be wildly difficult.
I'm going to say that's the actionable intelligence that you were trying to get immediately. And how often was that completely accurate, or just if they knew we were listening, were they talking in code? Did they try to change what they, we're moving east and then move west?
Yeah, and they talk in code, but like we know the code, right? So there's no my job title is airborne cryptologic linguist. Afghanistan, there's no cryptology, right? If you were flying against like Russians, yeah, okay, you probably gotta like break some stuff, like deal with encryption or whatever. The Taliban does not have encryption. The Taliban has high-powered walkie-talkies, push-to-talk radios. Um, they have code words, but we knew them all, and so they still use them. Like I don't really know why. 'Cause I know that they knew that we knew. Like it just had to be that they knew, but they did it anyway, just in case. I guess like the new guy didn't know, the code word or whatever. But yeah, if and when they tried to obfuscate things, it just like wasn't successful. So I didn't have to deal with a whole lot of that of like code breaking per se.
Mm-hmm. It says T-Bug in the chat here. I'm not sure if that's the actual name, T-Bug, but how organized were the Taliban? Were they just bands of roving tribes, somewhat coordinated? Were they somewhat coordinated or bands of roving tribes?
They're pretty, I mean, there are levels to this question. So the Taliban writ large, right, basically exists as like a way to develop money for certain people in high positions of power, and develop more power for them. It's like that's the dudes who they actually live in Pakistan and they don't fight anybody, and they're like deeply tied to Al Qaeda and the Pakistani government and all that stuff. Those guys super duper organized, right? They send out orders to dudes running around Afghanistan. Some of those dudes are just like roving tribes or whatever, like highway robbers, quite literally. We'll just stop your car on the highway and be like, give me all your stuff. I did not interact much with those dudes because I worked for AFSOC, we were generally, not always, but generally going after, high value targets and special operations missions and these sorts of things. And so the guys I was listening to were fairly well coordinated, right? They'd be like, oh, hey, we know the Americans are coming in. Cool. Have, our buddies from the next village over come and bring some more weaponry. But not like, wild military maneuvers or like dealing with anything beyond, I don't know, a couple dozen guys at a time, usually. I think they're the way Afghanistan is just geographically, it's relatively hard for them to be super organized, and they don't need to be as well. Like they could just do, fight a little bit here, fight a little bit there, fight a little bit over there. Like days of
They know the terrain so well.
They know the terrain so well, and it's like there aren't, no one's lining up and fighting each other anymore and like running cavalry at each other. It's like we might, even if we had a fob of a few hundred dudes or whatever, they're just gonna like run in and take a couple pot shots and then run off. Like because like otherwise it would be just running into machine gun fire and they're all gonna die and they know that and they're not that stupid. So it's like they'll run in, lob some orders or whatever, fire a couple of big guns, these sorts of things. But in like battles I was in, it's like no, they run around, they would talk a little bit the same way, our guys on the ground were talking, like move here, do this, do that. They had their own like way of being organized as true, military warfighters.
And then in the chat, Ben Wright, Air Force veteran, Vietnam veteran, what kinds of radio receivers / equipment did you have to listen to radio transmissions you were listening to? Multiple radio receivers?
I don't really remember the exact equipment, and even if I did, I couldn't tell you because that stuff is classified. It shouldn't be, but it is. I can very happily share they were using push talk radios, right? So high power walkie-talkies, ICOM is like a term people know. Like American military members, like guys on the ground, would use the same kind of radio, just more powerful and with the ability to have encryption. I could listen to multiple at once, right? So I wouldn't listen to a bunch at once because my equipment like didn't allow for that to be useful. It was physically possible, but not like a useful way of doing it. People who flew more complex planes, I have been told, could like listen to multiple conversations and sort of tune their headset. So it's like they're hearing one conversation sort of forward and one sort of backward. And so they could somehow like listen to those simultaneously and do wild things with that. I don't know how to do that. I never did that. In theory, I could listen to, a few different radios talking all at once, but then that would just get incredibly noisy and be really difficult to keep track of. So generally speaking, I would be listening to one or two at a time, but I could, you know, move through the electromagnetic spectrum and move from listening to this guy to this guy to this guy to this guy, and then sort of back around and in between.
Dave Seaver, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just have to ask a curiosity question, having been there and done that. I was in Bagram in 2010, and every spring the Taliban did their offensive, going around and basically they fired mortars and rockets into bases. They kind of went around to the different bases and did that, tried to breach the perimeter, when I was at Bagram and get some suicide vests on. They weren't successful. But prefacing that, my question was, did you ever hear, when they're going around doing these kind of attacks, were they targeting any specific things or facilities, or were they just hoping to hit something and have a win that way?
I don't know that I ever heard those sorts of conversations because I mean, like, I didn't think like two missions where I flew close to Kandahar. I never flew near Bagram. Like I flew up north plenty, but never like near actually Bagram's kind of in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
No, the closest maybe is like they were attacking a fob, but that was like the few times that happened to me, a forward operating base. The few times that happened where I heard it, it was, I mean, the target was pretty obvious. It was just a fob, right? Like, and unclear if that was just a target of opportunity. Like that day, they knew, there was like troops were rotating in and out or something, right? So it's like going to be kind of wild or whatever. I like the stuff I did was highly, highly tactical. So like I could be sitting around doing nothing, and then we would get called to go take off as soon as possible to fly to an ongoing firefight. So it's like everything's already happening at that point.
Right.
Or we're already flying and we're on like a generic surveillance mission, and then a firefight happens, and they're like, okay, go over here. And so like I know that what you're talking about isn't like strategic in the traditional usage of the word strategic,
Right.
but like compared to what I did, that is very strategic, and I didn't listen to that sort of thing.
Okay. Yeah, just because the briefing I got before I went in country was that they would target things like hospitals, because that's a big psychological, and so where was I going? The hospital, right? So,
Right.
they were basically just warning me to duck.
Yeah, and that makes sense, like that they would do that. Yeah.
So,
Todd, great question here. Did you get a sense of why the U.S. was there and what motivated us beyond revenge for 9/11 and the need to prevent another? And what did the Taliban or the people that you were listening to think of Americans?
I did not get a good sense of why we were there while I was there beyond this initial idea of revenge and then just functionally like inertia from that. I write a lot about this in the book, but the short version is I think that we were there because we were trying to convince ourselves that it was a good thing that we were there and that we wouldn't lose, which we all know now isn't true. And lots of people knew then wasn't going to be true, but that was the sense I got. Craig Whitlock wrote a book called The Afghanistan Papers, which features interviews with an awful lot of people from people at my level and over up to like Rumsfeld, like very powerful people. And that is sort of the same conclusion that's often reached in that book, that it was a lot of just like inertia and trying to convince ourselves that we were the good guys and trying to convince ourselves that we were winners. The slightly more cynical answer is also there's an awful lot of money to be had in war. So a lot of companies are pretty heavily invested in people continuing to fight war because they get to provide the bullets and they get to provide the meal services and all these sorts of things. So, as far as what the Taliban thought about Americans, they like us, you know. If you can separate the like, this is a relatively difficult ask, but if you can say to yourself, okay, yes, that's Taliban, but let me forget that they're Taliban for a moment. Let me forget that they're like these really bad dudes who throw acid in little girls' faces. Just for a moment. We can come back to that, and we should. But if you forget that for a moment, a lot of these guys are just like dudes living in a country where another country came and showed up and said, hey, we're going to destroy your government, institute a new government, put in a bunch of puppet figures, and then, oh, by the way, tell you all the things that you can and cannot do, despite the fact that you've had a country for thousands of years and you've developed your own culture and legacy. It's not unreasonable to be a little bugged by that. Now, the answer is not go throw acid in little girls' faces. That is ridiculous and awful and truly evil. But and they also just thought we were idiots because they knew that they would win. That's probably the weirdest, funniest, most surreal thing is that like it's a lot of braggadocio at some point. It's a lot of propagandizing for the Taliban to be running around like, yeah, you know, we killed so many and then they barely killed anybody. But in spirit, they killed an awful lot of us. And at the end of the day, they may as well have killed all of us because they drove us out, despite the $1 trillion we spent and the like ridiculous number of people who died trying to fight them.
Jim Roberts, I asked you to unmute. You have a question? Jim Roberts, U.S. Army Vietnam veteran.
I want to reset a little in your training. I'm a DLI alum.
Oh, cool.
About 30 years before you, and I also went to Texas. I was at Bixfield, Fort Bliss. I don't even know it exists. I had the 3-month Vietnamese intensive. At that time, we were aware of DLI Monterey, and from where we were, it sounded like the ideal place. But then we were hearing horror stories about the psychological impact of the intensity they were putting the students through, and it was like a two-edged sword, a wonderful place to be, but a horrible thing. You described a very different environment. What was the education like there? How intense was it? Was it 8 hours a day or 12 hours a day where you couldn't speak English? You had to speak the native language?
It is very intense. So, I mean, yeah, so 8 hours a day, you're not supposed to speak the language. When you first start out, that's like kind of impossible because you don't know anything. You only know English, or maybe you know Spanish or whatever, but you know. But pretty quickly that becomes a standard. Because you'd be shocked. Like a month in, you sound like a 4-year-old, but like you don't need to speak English because you need to be like, I want that, I want this, I have a question. And you know, that breaks down when it's like, okay, I have a question that I cannot ask in the, you know, language, whatever. It was and probably still is pretty mentally taxing. The washout rate was incredibly high, right? I mean, my class wasn't so bad, but so for instance, for Pashto, when I was at language school the first time, the washout rate for Pashto was like 70%. By the time I got there for Pashto, it was slightly less bad because what they had decided was that it could not be a year, it needed to become a year and a half because it probably wasn't possible to learn the language in 1 year, even though they'd been trying that for a very long time. So other languages, I think Vietnamese is a year, but like Arabic is a year and a half, Russian's a year, Chinese is a year and a half, Korean's a year and a half. There are certain languages that they've just decided like it's not possible to do it that quickly because it would be so intense. I do think that there's this weird sense from other people that, so like when I got to Goodfellow in Texas for a cryptologic school, all the sergeants and stuff there like really didn't like all the people coming from language school, the airmen, the like baby airmen, because they're like, oh, you were just at college. That's what they thought, is that we were just like, oh, at college, basically civilians running around. And like, don't get me wrong, we were not in Big Blue Air Force, like life was not all that hard, but we still had to do, you know, we had to go to PT however many days a week, and we would get our dorms woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning because some idiot got caught smoking pot, and like, so everyone's room's gonna get, you know, swept. And like, okay, that's not that big a deal in the grand scheme of things, except for the fact that you just woke me up at 3 o'clock in the morning and now I got to go to language school in another language for 8 hours that day. Well, that's like pretty hard, I guess, right? And then I think a lot of people just like get there and they're like, I did not sign up for this. They don't have because the military's not good at explaining it. They don't say, yeah, you're going to go to class for 8 hours a day. You're going to have an hour to 2 of homework every night, and you're going to have 3 to 4 hours of homework every day on the weekend for a year. Congrats. If they told you that going in, it might be a little bit smaller washout rate because a lot of people would go, "Oh no, I don't want to do that. Please and thank you."
Todd, you're risking a stupid question. Your words, not mine. Ian, did the Taliban ever shoot at your planes?
They shot at my planes very rarely. My entire first deployment, I was on at the time it was MC-130W. It was a plane that was in the process of becoming a new gunship, the next generation gunship. We flew like a 15, 16, 17, 18,000 feet. So you like basically couldn't shoot at us. My second deployment, I flew on proper gunships, U-boats. If people in Vietnam, they all know what a U-boat is. Those fly like 10,000 feet, so you could physically shoot at us, but they generally didn't because to shoot at a gunship is to die. So I didn't get shot at one mission. We think someone tried to fire a rocket at us when we were taking off, but like we don't really know that it's true. Other types of planes, so my best friend and lots of other people who did my job flew on low flying MC-130s. Those got shot at all the time. So like my friend was sitting in his seat and a bullet went through the plane like right there. And another guy I know had one go through right there. And another guy hit the bottom of the seat that he was in, which is plated for that exact reason. But gunships don't tend to get shot at. By the time I was there, they did not tend to get shot at because to shoot at it with like tiny guns, with like, handguns, like wouldn't really matter. Even a rifle wouldn't really matter and it would get you killed. And they didn't have the big weaponry that could hurt a gunship anymore because we had blown all of it up.
Greg Yost, you had your hand up?
Yes, thank you so much. This is a great presentation. I am going to ask a question about the linguistic culture of Afghanistan and what you heard. I also mentioned earlier in the chat that I think this is the first Veterans Breakfast Club ever where the name Ludwig Wittgenstein was ever mentioned. And Brad Washabaugh put in, he finally has a topic for his doctoral dissertation, but we want to thank you for that. But somewhat more seriously, my understanding is that most of Afghanistan is illiterate. And most of the people cannot read or write. And that actually creates culturally sort of a very different situation with regard to the spoken word. It becomes much more important. Well, obviously, you probably have more dialects and everything like that. But comment on the notion that Afghanistan being largely illiterate and how that affects the linguistic culture and how it probably allows sort of like random militants and preachers and everything to sort of gin people up in a way that if people are literate, they can't really sort of, it's much harder to do. Not that it's impossible, but it's harder.
Oh yeah, I mean the biggest thing there is that, right? So Islam is predicated on a knowledge of Arabic, right? Like you must know Arabic to read the Quran. It's not unless you got a translation. I'm here to tell you I think there was one translation of the Quran into Pashto. You're not really supposed to translate the Quran anyway, but like, okay, let's accept that you did. One translation of Pashto, yeah, who fucking cares? No one can read Pashto, right? It's not taught in schools. Like, you're not taught how to read it. You go to school until you're 10, maybe if you're lucky, if you're a boy, and then you go work in a field the rest of your life. If you're a girl, you're SOL, you're not going to learn in the first place. Dari, maybe people know Arabic a little bit better, but like it's not. But I mean, this is true of Islam, like the world round, outside of the few countries where it is just spoken Arabic. Like people who live in Indonesia, they don't tend to speak Arabic. Like, so you can just tell them anything you want. I mean, this if you go look at England, right, prior to Henry, whatever his number was, who had all the wives, right? It was illegal to print the Bible in English,
Right.
because no one wanted anybody to know what it actually said because it was a way to develop power. So even, I mean, the number of mullahs who are like, functionally just like priests running around in Afghanistan who claim, they absolutely will have like the entire Quran memorized. It's wild to just memorize something in a language that you don't know. But how many of them like could read it and tell you what it says? Not that many, dude. But it doesn't matter because no one else knows either. So they can just say, okay, here, I'm gonna tell you what it says. Beyond that, largely, most of the version of Islam practiced in Afghanistan is an export of Wahhabism, which is this like hyper draconian, ridiculously militant version of it, propagated by Saudi Arabia in their efforts to just like fuel discord around the world. And so even if you did understand Arabic, you'd be understanding it under the guise of this like wildly violent version, this interpretation of Islam and of what the Quran says.
That answer your question, Greg?
Pretty much. So, in other words, someone could say anything they wanted to say, and no one could really prove them wrong because they didn't have the books. Yeah.
No, I mean, so I had a teacher when I was learning Pashto, really young woman, not really, in her early 20s, had just recently come to America from Afghanistan. She was a few months pregnant. It was Ramadan. She was fasting. And I was like, what are you doing? Like, you can't be fasting. You're like 6 months pregnant, lady. And she's like a tiny human. She's like, oh, I have to fast. No, it's Ramadan. You have to fast. And I was like, there's an exception for pregnancy. Like, I don't know how I knew that, but I didn't know that to be true. And she's like, I don't think that's true. I was like, dude, it's definitely true. She went home, asked somebody the next day. She came back. She was like, oh, yeah, you were right. She was drinking some water. She had no fucking clue because somebody had once told her, like, no, it's Ramadan. You just got to fast. I don't care if you're pregnant. And like, that's really dangerous to you and your fetus.
Josh Cannon, you have your hand up?
Well, I wanted to say hi, a fellow DLI alum. I was a linguist for the Marine Corps, Arabic linguist. So Ian and Jim and me and maybe somebody else out there that hasn't revealed themselves. And I wanted to ask really quickly if Zentner's Daughter is still the best steak place in San Angelo, or maybe it doesn't exist anymore.
I have no idea, dude.
I guess it doesn't. All right, that's too bad. Well, then my real question is, so when I was in, I went to Iraq for the invasion in so I was in DLI from 2000 to 2002, and then I was there for the invasion of Iraq, and then I went back in 2004. And when we were in school, we hung out, all the services hung out together. The Marines always aided the Air Force, and, we played sports together and, had rivalries and all that goofy stuff, but we were all pretty friendly. And then we went to Goodfellow Air Force Base, and that kind of continued, although we were kind of split up into different schools when we got to that stage. And then we all deployed and never saw any of the services again. It's kind of sad. So I just wanted to see if maybe you had the same experience, or maybe you got to work with different services a little bit more.
No, I mean, my language school, so Arabic, right, bigger classes. You guys would have like 150-person classes. My class was like 20. My understanding, Arabic, Chinese, Russian, like these big languages, you had all this stuff. My whole class there was one army guy and started out 4 Marines and ended with 2, I think. And then, yeah, I don't know. So my experience is like very, very Air Force at DLI, but I think that was just like the makeup of my class or whatever. At Goodfellow, I never saw any other service people. It was just Air Force for me. My job, I worked for like every branch, right? Because I could be flying on a mission that was Army or Marine or not Navy, but okay, and some Navy, some SEALs, or Air Force or whatever. But like on my camp, it was all just Air Force, so I like never physically interacted. We had a couple, missions where like some Marines would fly with us, whatever. But no, it was, even though I worked for everybody, my like day-to-day life was just Air Force.
We're going to take a quick station break here. Todd, I want to pop it over to you if you have our announcements.
Yeah, this is the Veterans Breakfast Club, and we have fascinating conversations like the one we're having tonight. This is a little higher level than the ones we usually have, but it's exactly the kind of thing that we do in person, online. We have conversations about the military experience, past and present, with people of all branches of service and in eras. For example, I lied before. I said Ed Cottrell was the oldest veteran we have on. That's not true. I see that Julia Parsons, who is also a cryptologist in World War II, is on our program. She was a Navy wave. Julia, if you want to unmute yourself, you can, and then you could tell people how old you're going to be when you have your birthday on March 2nd. Oh, no, let's see. Here we go. Let's see. Oh, sometimes I think she clicked end call. She'll be back in the room, I'm guessing. She's going to be 103. She's going to be 103 on March 2nd. Very, very sharp, very interested in this conversation. I know she is. She wanted to sign up for a class at the University of Pittsburgh this spring, but she didn't know how she would get to class. It was about code breaking. So those are the kinds of people who come on our programs. Just a fascinating thing. You can find out more about our programming and check out our whole schedule at veteransbreakfastclub.org. We have another event coming up on Thursday night, and Glenn Flickinger, you are the host of this program, Greatest Generation Live, where we are reviewing all of the episodes of Masters of the Air. And if you've been following Masters of the Air, you know that several of the members of the 100th Bomb Group characters are now in POWs. And so the series is turning to that experience. Glenn, are you on this evening? I saw that you were before. You may
Saw
have
him earlier, but I haven't seen him.
Okay, so we are going to focus on the
There he
POW.
is. He's here.
Hey,
We'll ask you to. There you are, Glenn.
Yep. I've just been quietly listening in the background to this fascinating discussion. But yes, Thursday night, we've got Colin Heath, who's been with us almost every Thursday night on this Masters of the Air series. I'm going to ask him to talk about the Luftwaffe fighter pilots, a different point of view, obviously. And then the woman you see there is Marilyn Walton, who is considered one of the preeminent experts on the POW experience. Both were technical consultants to the Masters of the Air program. And then in addition, we're having the 96 bomb group historian on, a woman by the name of Anita Sisba. Todd, I never have figured out how to pronounce her last name. Her father was a POW, shot down on his 25th mission. Unbelievable. So should be an interesting discussion Thursday night. The last episode, by the way, I thought was the best. And there was not one combat scene. It just was incredibly good.
Yeah.
Please
I
watch.
I agree. It was something else. Thank you, Glenn. I'm looking forward to this conversation on Thursday night at 7. And then a week from tonight, we'll be back. This will be the first program we have during Women's History Month, and we'll be talking with 3 fascinating women who were really on the front lines of this struggle to allow women to serve in combat. Joy Bronson, Navy, Ellen Herring, Army, and Lori Fenner, Air Force. They're going to be joining us with Daria Summer and Sean, who will be hosting the program. Speaking of women, we do have Julia Parsons with us. Julia, you are back on. I think you're unmuted. We'll certainly be. Julia,
Yes,
how do you feel about your birthday coming up?
I'm going to miss having parades and parties.
There's no parade or party. We should schedule
I said
one.
I'll miss it.
Yeah. You were a cryptologist. You weren't a linguist, but you were a code breaker. And so I imagine you find this conversation tonight pretty interesting.
It certainly was. I was fascinated.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us, Julia. I want to be in touch with you about a couple things. Again, Julia is turning 103 on Saturday. That's amazing. What's your secret to longevity, Julia?
Well, thank you.
Okay, I'll see you. Take care. Thank you for joining us. I do want to get back and also thank our sponsors for sponsoring our event. As Sean mentioned, Tobacco Free Adagio Health is a sponsor and has been for a long time. They're dedicated to preventing and reducing tobacco use, educating people about tobacco hazards, and advocating for healthier places to live, work, and play. You can find out more about them at tobaccofree.adagiohealth.org. And we have UPMC for Life also sponsoring our programming. UPMC for Life can help you make sense of Medicare, get the answers and information you need, such as how to choose the Medicare Advantage plan that's right for you. UPMC for Life has plans designed by veterans and for veterans, and they can save you money and get you more benefits. And you can check out all your plan options by going to upmchealthplan.com/Medicare. That's upmchealthplan.com/Medicare. Our magazine should be out in people's mailboxes. We send them out now. We're sending them out now to 9,000 households nationwide, printing up another 8,000 for hand distribution. If you would like a box or if you would like one in your mailbox, please let me know and we send them out for free. Todd@veteransbreakfastclub.org. That's Todd@veteransbreakfastclub.org. Send me an email, let me know, and I'll make sure that we get a box or one magazine if you just want one. And again, these are where we take the stories that we hear, shared at our events, and we write them up in magazine form. And then finally, we have a survey, 2.5-minute survey after every program. We hope that you'll take it. Let us know what you think of this program, what you liked, what you didn't like, how we can improve. We take these very seriously and we learn a lot from them. So thank you to all of you, the several hundred of you now who have taken the survey, and you've really inspired some changes and will continue to inspire some changes. All right. Back to you, Sean.
Thanks. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention Lioness, the podcast. We have done 11 episodes of Lioness. Consider that March 4th program with the three amazing women as an extension of the Lioness podcast, as Daria is getting these wonderful women together to talk about where we've gotten to, sort of story-wise, from the podcast. And if you don't know anything about the Lioness Origin Story podcast, it's a phenomenal listen. 11 episodes of amazing stories from women who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Whereas the story started with the lionesses, who were developed because we could not frisk women and children. They started taking women out of the forward operating bases to help out with this. This was the Army. They dubbed them lionesses. They ended up in combat prior to the combat exclusion policy being removed. So they were in combat, and that was never put on their military forms. So they don't have any history of it. They don't recognize for it. The lionesses were sort of the program was adopted by the Marines. They became the female engagement teams, and that has further since evolved into the cultural support teams. Now it's become, after the combat exclusion policy was removed, it's become a fight to get these women recognition for the combat that they saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. So please give the Lioness podcast a listen. We've had many different guests on over the course of those 11 episodes. And it's the only place you're going to find it is VBC. So please look it up, check it out. You can get it anywhere that podcasts are released. Daria Summers, who is the host of it, does a phenomenal job. And if you are looking up Daria as well, she's a documentarian who also directed the movie Lioness on Prime. If you have Amazon Prime, go on there, check out Lioness, and I highly recommend watching that. Ian, back to you. We have a few more minutes here. I have a couple more questions that I'd like to get to, but I think something that sort of leads us into that, Renee put here in the chat, and I'm sorry, not Renee, Hal put that in the chat. Was there any direction finding capability on board the C-130s to locate the Taliban speakers? Did you know where they were?
On paper, yes. In reality, no. On paper, we had this ability, but it didn't actually work. So it was mostly context clues, listening. They'd say, I'm not in context. They would outright say, I'm by the red house, which is next to the tree at the intersection of these two roads or whatever. Or sometimes they didn't, which was very frustrating. They wouldn't say where they were, and there was no ability to find them, which was a major deficit in our capabilities.
Deb put in, speaking about the Lioness, did you hear women speak? Were you ever tuned into what the women were saying?
No, never once.
Which is interesting because, talking with, as I mentioned earlier, people who had gone down into the actual towns, the cultural support teams, those women would start to talk with the women there, and they would start to find out way more than they could get from any of the men, because the women were sick of all of the fighting and they were sick of their sons going off to these wars. So they would start telling them everywhere, hey, this is where the weapon stashes are. So you probably wouldn't be able to hear much of that.
I mean, they wouldn't be allowed to use the radios is the biggest thing. So,
and did you get to know any of the guys that were the special ops that you were connected with?
I didn't. The way my camp was set up at Kandahar, we didn't really interact with anybody. At Bagram, so my best friend did a fair number of deployments to Bagram, and they were next to insert creepy, scary men who run around at night killing people. And he got to know them because they were literally next to each other in very close proximity. But I didn't really have that option.
How many missions did you fly over the course of 2 deployments?
2 deployments. It's either 100 or 101. I think I have 99 on paper, and then there's one that's definitely missing because I flew in a kind of a weird aircraft that the military decided not to record. And I actually did that twice, so it's probably 101.
there wasn't a limit. You were there for your year. There wasn't like you reach, like we've talked about Masters of the Air. They get 25 flights and they were allowed to go back.
Oh no, we nowadays you have hour limits. You can only fly so many hours in a set period of time. So the biggest one is that in 90 days you can only fly 330 hours. And so like people who fly on the rivet joint that other plan I was talking about, they would fly like every third day because they would fly like 16-hour missions. And so very, very quickly they would hit the limit. But because my missions could be a lot shorter, I could just fly 8 days in a row and take a day off and then fly a bunch and then so on and so forth.
Greg put into the chat, did you, I don't believe so, but did you ever interrogate any prisoners as interpreter?
No. Wildly different skill set.
And you mentioned, I think it's mentioned in the book that do you have confirmed KIAs? Were those credited to you? How did that work?
I have enlisted performance report, which is like your annual, performance review or whatever that the Air Force does. So I have 123 EKIA. That's a relatively inflated number, mostly because my very first mission, so many dudes got killed. That's just like the simple number to bandy about because I don't know, I have it on paper. I feel that I have probably personally killed like 20 people, maybe slightly more. I 100% like really killed 2 guys, just because like the way the mission worked out. But I was on enough missions where we killed a lot of dudes that it's somewhere between 20 and I don't know, somewhere between 20 and 40 probably that I would actually say are mine. 123 is not really mine, but that's what the Air Force says I did. So
how is that process determined that you were the one responsible? Is it because you called in the
it's
position?
not, yeah, right. It's fuzzy, man. Like I was, so the thing that's on paper is that like I was on missions that totaled up to 123 thousands dead. Like you can look at every mission I flew on and you can look at the after action report and you can say this many dudes died and this many dudes died and you can add all that up. I mean, this wasn't done. Like it doesn't work that way that you say like, right, there's on a U-boat, there's 14 guys on the plane. It's not really the case that any one person killed anybody, right? Like, because you could say, well, okay, the camera operator like found the guy and then pushed the button, but he couldn't push the button unless the fire control officer had done all of his wizardry and given the order to, and he couldn't have done that unless the pilot was flying the plane, and nobody could have fired any of the bullets unless the 4 gunners in the back had loaded the gun. So like, who killed who? Then you could say, okay, you found the dude, but then I'm the one who heard what they were saying and said, no, that's a bad dude, we kill him. And then I'm like, probably I killed that dude. It's not like I'm the only one who killed that dude. Everybody else with me also killed that dude. But that's where I feel that like I have something to do with it, I guess. Versus if like we were flying around and the camera operator just found a guy and like we just shot him. Okay, I was there, but like what did I do?
And this extends sort of into a bit of what we talked about when you visited me on the scuttlebutt, but maybe an extension of that is the idea of like, did you ever feel responsible for that whenever you got back, whenever you transitioned out? And I know that we talked a bit about how you went into like the medical field as sort of like a counterbalance to like what you'd gone through in the military.
Yeah, I mean, killing people change you probably forever. I think it's forever. I don't know, I'm not that old, but it hasn't gone anywhere yet, and it's been a little while. So I spent a very long time kind of ignoring it, or not, if not ignoring it, then not doing any sort of reckoning with it, that's for sure. Eventually I did have to reckon with it, and I tried to reckon with it by going to medical school and thinking to myself that if I helped save people or keep them alive, then that would undo killing them, but it turns out that's not true. So I don't do that anymore either. Now it's just like it's like a thing that's a part of me, I guess.
We have a documentary with BBC. Is it We Left His Brother's Todd? It's very interesting to me during that documentary that a Vietnam veteran and is it a North Vietnamese veteran or is it Viet Cong?
North Vietnamese.
North Vietnamese they see each other, they talk to each other, they hug. It's a very powerful moment in this documentary. Is that something that, like, do you feel like you'd ever go back to Afghanistan, and do you feel like you could ever talk with somebody from the other side and maybe have this sort of human interaction?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it won't ever happen. I'm not going there because, like, I don't know, how would I get there and what would I do? But if I could, yeah, we'd probably tell dick jokes. In all likelihood, because the right dude, right? Like the right dude who wasn't doing it because he was a wild religious zealot who wanted to throw acid in a little girl's face. Like the dude who was doing it because the Taliban came up to him one day and said, "Hey, I'm gonna steal all your food, and make it so that you and your family starve to death next winter unless you fight for us." That dude, 100% I could tell jokes with. There aren't a lot of that dude. Like, I mean, there's a fair number. There's a lot of the like religious zealot dudes, and I don't want anything to do with those guys. But the guys who like kind of got co-opted into it, absolutely.
Going back to your book, What the Taliban Told Me, I love the story about how did you come to writing the book?
So 3 years ago now, as the Taliban was taking back Afghanistan, I was finishing medical school in Pittsburgh. COVID was a new thing, and but I had a lot of feelings about the Taliban doing this, and then I had a lot of feelings about my feelings, and I didn't know what to do with any of that, so I wrote them down, because that seemed like a reasonable way to get them out of my head at least. I sent that essay, the essay that came from that. I had some very wonderful professors in my life help me edit it. I sent it to the Atlantic. The Atlantic published it right around the actual like fall of Kabul, right around when they really took everything back and we like skedaddled. That was for about a week very popular on the internet, and my now book agent found me because of that, and he called me and said, "You ever thought about writing a book?" And I said, "Absolutely not." And he said, "You should write a book." And I said, "Let me think about it." And he called me out on Friday, and that weekend I talked to my partner and said, "Okay, sure, why not? Give it a shot." And then I called him back and I said, "Cool, I'll do it. How do I write a book?" And he said, "You'll figure it out." And he hung up. I figured it out. I don't know. Writing like a book, like a fiction book or like a nonfiction book about somebody else, I think is really quite difficult. Someone says like, "Hey, write about yourself for like 200 and something pages." I don't know. I think most of us can do it.
So someone, anybody here that looks to pick up the book, we put the link into the chat. What the Taliban Told Me. Ian, what do you hope that someone who picks up the book, what do you hope they learn about the Taliban? What they hope they learn about you, what you did?
As far as learning about the Taliban, they are not that big evil monolith. The simplest version I can explain is that there's like a capital T Taliban and a lowercase t Taliban. The capital T Taliban are very, very bad and should be eradicated from the face of the earth. The lowercase t Taliban are often just a lot of really poor guys in a really fucked up country trying to not die. And so do it that way you will, but even all the really shitty ones are still just people and human beings. Yeah, with a few exceptions, the ones who are just like animals, those guys, who cares about those guys? But the other guys, the ones who are human beings, it's worth thinking about like the fact that they are also human beings and like what does that mean for our interactions in the world with like everyone else. As far as what you learn about me, I'm not that important. I don't know. I'm the one who wrote the book just because I'm one of the few number of people who did that job. But I would say outside of learning about the Taliban, stories. Stories are incredibly important, and stories are healing, and stories are probably the one thing that can maybe, if not save us all, then at least keep us from dying in a fiery hellscape. And so if you get the chance to listen to other people's stories, do it. And hopefully they change your life.
Well, that's certainly what we're all about here. Ian, I want to thank you for your time tonight and for your stories and for sharing all of that with us. Todd, I'd like to hand it off to you here for any final words.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Thank you for joining us and sharing kind of what you learned from the Taliban, what you learned from your service. It sounds like you're still learning it. sounds like in some case, in one certain way, you're learning what innumerable generations of other warriors have learned about the enemy. And so thank you for giving us, in a sense, an update. I think a lot of our veterans who are in the Zoom room tonight have come to the realization that the people they fought were human, including Julia Parsons, who has talked about that as she has come to understand the people who were in the German U-boats that she helped to sink in 1943, 1944. Thank you so much for joining us, Ian. Thank you all for joining us here in the Zoom room and on Facebook and on YouTube. I hope to see you Thursday night for Masters of the Air. Take care. Enjoy the evening.